Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
We are the Stinemetz brothers, and we call ourselves the Pseudo Scholars. This is our podcast where we really believe that science isn't just for scientists. Science is for anyone with integrity who honestly wants to know more about the world, and that's what we're after. So each week, we're going to put our scientific hats on and grapple with some of the most challenging questions and topics that we can think of.
Yeah, we like asking questions like, what's the future of transportation in the world? Or what is it about the data-driven operations that made the Trump campaign so successful? These are the kinds of topics that we really want to sink our teeth into, learn as much as we can about them, and see how we can apply them to our life so that we'll walk away from conversations like this more stimulated, informed, and inspired.
Yeah.
So this week we're talking about living well. And we talked about last week how living well starts with thinking well. So we've done a two-part series. So if you're interested in part one, and encourage you to go out and check out one of our historical podcasts. But we did part one on what is bad thinking. So we basically talked about this list, this laundry list of cognitive biases that we all have that keeps us from thinking in a more accurate, rational way. So we deconstructed the way that we think poorly last week. And then this week, we really want to dive into what is good thinking. Because if I want to live well, I really need to think well. So this is all about the quest for rationality.
Yeah, and I want to say that I have never been more convinced, maybe in my life, that we need to be better thinkers, Cade. I've put this one into the forefront of my mind for the last several weeks now, and I've been taking this course. It's called The Science of Thinking, and it's one of those 13-week MIT courses. MIT is basically open sourced all of their content, so you can't get the degree necessarily, but you can go and take the course. And it's been a wake-up call for me. I think it's actually called me to question my own accuracies and my intuitions and perceptions. I think I've really learned that human intuition is highly unreliable, starting with my own. Human beings aren't very good at predicting the outcomes of events. And it seems that overall, we don't have nearly as much control over our own minds and even over our own behaviors as we think. And that really causes me to settle for a second. Isn't that tough to deal with?
Yeah, no, it is. I think about the Trump presidency and how very few people really saw it coming. But then when you go back and look at the different strategies that the two campaigns employed, and we talk about this in one of our podcasts, but really you see that Trump's advisors ran a smarter, more data-driven campaign, and actually were probably more efficient with their time, with their dollars, and really kind of upended what we thought was going to be the clear winner and the clear decision maker. So that's just an example of how we're really not that good, and some of the things that we feel most sure about often aren't nearly as clear as we think they are.
Yeah, and one very practical thing that people can do if they just want to get a little bit better idea of what's going on in their minds on a given moment. I started meditating about 2 years ago, so I might think that I'm getting better at it over the past 2 years, but the reality is just sit in silence for 10 minutes and watch what happens. Watch your thoughts, focus on your breath. You can do any of these things that are part of the techniques, but if nothing else, just sit in silence and watch your thoughts and watch what happens. And you'll kind of realize that you're crazy a little bit. Neurons are firing along these brain synapses, and it's happening so fast that we're very even rarely aware of what's happening. And these thoughts are practically happening to us as opposed to us making them happen. And that's a little bit scary, especially when you think that now we've seen that statistical models are pretty much better at predicting our own behavior than we are. So for me, Cade, this makes me ask, so what? Well, it makes me think we need to be better thinkers. But I'm kind of curious, what does good thinking look like?
Right. So last week we talked about two different systems for thinking. We talked about system one thinking and system two thinking. And for those that weren't aware or didn't listen to the podcast, system one thinking was essentially applying biological responses, type of thinking and type of reactions to decisions that are really not time sensitive. So what I mean here is when you put your hand on the stove, it's good to be intuitive and go with your gut and say, take my hand off the stove because it's burning. Right? But the fact of the matter is, and we talked about it, we're really not faced with decisions like that on day-to-day basis. And we talked about three different questions. They were really interesting, right? Should I vote for Donald Trump? Should I marry this person that I'm considering marrying? And should I believe in God? Those are all huge decisions that have massive implications on your life that we really need to be more data-driven and more rational in our approaches to how we make those decisions. And so that's really what we called system two thinking, right? Where we sit, we analyze, we let the data help correct some of our intuitions or affirm our intuitions, and that by using system 2 processing, we're going to get to the more logical the more logical result that's based on information and data, as opposed to just what our perceptions are in the moment.
Yeah, and there's one good concept that makes this click for me, at least. It's called the map and territory conflict. So basically what's happening with the map and territory arrangement is that as a topographer or a map maker is trying to develop a process for showing how a certain terrain is laid, it'd be very important to actually explore that terrain, wouldn't it? You know, we can't make an actual map of a location until we've walked along that route. So what we're saying here is that rationality often is about revising beliefs in light of new evidence. New information presents itself, and we should take that information and then scribble it onto the map, and we'll have a better map. And there's one really cool example of a guy who did this in history, Cade, and we're going to get into several examples, but one in particular that's always been inspiring to me is the case of Alan Turing, who's that English mathematician, maybe one of the founding fathers of computer science. I think people would say that, but he's really famous because he was a crypto analyst in World War II, and he cracked a German cipher. So the English military brought together, all of these great cryptographers. Most of them were mathematicians and scientists, etc. And he cracked this code that basically gave us information about what the Germans were doing before they were doing it. It was an intelligence thing that really helped turn the tide of the war, actually, a very impactful event that happened in World War II. But the thing about Alan Turing is he was really uncanny in his ability to practice system 2 thinking and think about the probabilities of his actions as opposed to reacting with intuition or perception or emotion. And those are all the things that we've been calling into question. So he was making database decisions using logic. And he was really kind of well known for trying to apply Bayes' reasoning and game theory in everyday decision making. And for me, as a guy who didn't study economics in school, I can barely even remember what those are about, Cade. But I know ultimately we're after trying to make decisions that correspond to reality as closely as possible. We want our beliefs to correspond to reality. I think that's what Bayes' theory and game theory have to deal with. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about Bayes' theory or Bayes' reasoning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But before we dive into that, Shane, wasn't there, you were telling me about this result of this guy's type of thinking. So obviously he was able to crack some of the codes, but what kind of effects did that have long-term on the war?
Well, yeah, actually historians do say, I guess there's some arguments between whether or not it could have shortened World War II by between 1 and 2 years because of his abilities to get this information from the Germans that led them to some naval victories because they knew where the German submarines and ships were going to be positioned. So, pretty impressive feat.
Yeah, we really can't underestimate the types of results that applying this type of thinking can do, right? That's hundreds of thousands of lives that he potentially saved on both sides of the war. So anyways, I just want to unpack that little detail. But yeah, Shane, you're right. Thomas Bayes. So I want to just give a little bit of a background, and we can kind of lay the foundation for Bayes' theorem and Bayes' reasoning, as it's called in some different professions. But anyways, Thomas Bayes lived in the 18th century. He was a statistician, he was a philosopher, and he was also a Presbyterian minister. And when he went off to school at the University of Edinburgh, he studied logic and theology. And so this guy was really just a great thinker in general, right? He had a lot of different disciplines and contributed to academia and to theology and things like that, and philosophy in a lot of different ways. So he was just a brilliant guy. But I just wanted to draw just a little bit of perspective on how eclectic this guy was, right? So he's really known for two different things. Work number one was a work called Divine Benevolence, which basically was an attempt to prove that the principal end of divine providence and government is the happiness of creatures. So it's really a work of theology and Christian theology about if God's sovereign, what is the result of man's life on this world. But anyways, so it's a divine benevolence. So he wrote a argument on that. And then, oh, by the way, he decides that he's going to go and write an introduction on the doctrine of fluxions. And don't ask me what fluxions are, because I couldn't really grasp my mind around what the exact definition of that was. But essentially, right after Newton developed calculus, some people were trying to poke some holes in the foundation, the logical foundation of calculus, and Bayes just kind of wiped him off the map with his defense of it when he wrote his introduction to the doctrine of fluxions. And he calls everything doctrines because he's a minister. But anyways, so he's a brilliant guy. But let's get into Bayes' theorem just a little bit, right?
Okay.
So essentially what Bayes' theorem is, it's a formula that's used for calculating problems about conditional probability. So it basically describes that given an event happening And if I have knowledge about the conditions in which that event might happen, and they're related, I might be able to say something more predictive with some power about the result of that outcome.
Sure, that makes sense. Do you have like a thought experiment or an example? Because it does kind of require a little bit of brain thinking here. It requires some system 2 thinking just to get our heads wrapped around what he's saying here.
Right, exactly. So here's one, right? So it says, what is the probability that the Cleveland Cavaliers are going to beat the Warriors given or if LeBron scores 30 or more points, right? Yeah, so Shane's a West Coast guy. I'm kind of more the working class kind of guy out here in Houston.
Get out
dirty, all that kind of stuff. But anyways, yeah, so basically I want to know what's the probability that Cleveland or Golden State are going to win given that I know LeBron James is going to score 30 points. So it's basically a way of zoning in on LeBron James scoring 30 points or more or 30 points or less and how that affects the overall probability. So for anyone out there that's kind of a math geek, just the formula is essentially that the probability of event A given B, so that would be Cleveland winning, giving LeBron scores 30 points, is equal to the probability that LeBron scores 30 points and they win, times the probability that they win divided by the probability that he scores 30 points. And of course, that's just some formulas, right? But if you look at the math, it gives us unbelievable explanatory power to look at some of these decisions. And these are really practical things that we can apply Bayes' theorem to and look at and garner some really good inductions from.
Well, I'd love to learn how to do that. I mean, I guess I can understand your example and drawing out a probability sequence on a chalkboard or something, but what if I haven't got the time to do that? How can I at least start to consider Bayes' theorem in everyday thinking, or is that even possible?
Right. So I absolutely think it's possible. Now, obviously, one caveat that we have to lay out here is that usually when we're making decisions, we have to have probabilities. In order to do Bayes' theorem, we have to have numbers, right, between 0 and 100, because that's the way that probability works. So it's very challenging to ascribe exact values to these kinds of decisions because we're human beings, and like we're saying, essentially, we're fairly unpredictable, at least in some ways, or we're predictably unpredictable. Maybe that's the way that we say it. But let me walk through another scenario. Maybe this will help. So we talk about solving these kind of conditional probability questions by drawing trees. So I essentially want to give you a scenario where Emily and I, my wife and I, are going to decide where we want to go to eat. And so you want to take the information that you know about Emily and I, who's deciding where to go to eat, and our preferences, and without knowing where we went, we could tell you a certain result, and you would be able to decide who decided where they wanted to go eat. So we basically look at two different restaurants, Torchy's Tacos and Chick-fil-A. And if I get to decide, I want to go to Chick-fil-A more, right? Because I like it better and it's cheaper. That's the way that I make decisions, right?
Of course.
And my wife, of course, wants to go to Torchy's and get herself, the most expensive taco on the menu because that's the way my wife is and I love her for it. But essentially what it does is we can look at the probabilities individually of the first sequence of events, which is, does Cade choose or does Emily choose, right? And then we look at all the different possibilities of, well, what if Cade chooses Chick-fil-A? What's the odds? What if he chooses Torchy's? What are the odds? And then we do the same thing for Emily. And so we draw out this tree that goes into different sequences of events. And then by multiplying across, we actually come up with a foundational 1 through 1 or 0 through 100 number. And we can say with some kind of probability that someone else made the decision. So if I told you that we went to Torchy's, and when I run the numbers on this, I basically can tell you that there's a 92% chance that Emily decided where we would go eat. And it's based on the individual probability. So maybe that is somewhat helpful for people that are trying to envision a little bit about what Bayes' theorem works out to be.
Conceptually, I'm grasping it better now. I think that it can be applied in other areas of life outside of just these mathematical equations. But the idea is still that you're accounting for probability far above that of intuition or perception. And hopefully we've disproved how intuition and perception are considerably worse options if you're trying to make decisions that are going to benefit you the best. If you're trying to make a decision that benefits your own outcome, using probability sequences like Bayes' theorem makes a lot of sense.
Right. And I could give you probability of different events, and I could give you 3 events, and I could show you how to solve these questions on a probability tree, and it might take an hour. And I think you could probably grasp at least simple types of examples. But basically what it makes us do is think in more detail about what are the actual mechanisms beneath the decisions that are causing it, right? Because that's what I want to know. So instead of just saying, is Kate or Emily going to choose today? I want to know, what day of the week it is, because for whatever reason they've decided that Emily gets stressed out on Monday through Friday because she's working. She doesn't want to make decisions. Well, I want to know, how does that affect the ability of either Cade or Emily to make the decision, or how does that affect the outcome? But you're right. Bayes' theorem is really just a more detailed view of probability and looking at how these conditional probabilities of different events lead to different outcomes. But the applications are really much broader than solving these questions on a math board.
Right. And then the other principle that I like to draw on is the idea that we're still continuously revising and updating our position based off of evidence. As evidence makes itself more available, maybe you guys go back and forth between Chick-fil-A and Torchy's for 6 months, and more information, another variable is available for you in making your decisions or understanding who's choosing the restaurant each time. Like, one of the best examples of this is probably just like in theoretical physics. For hundreds and thousands of years now, or at least for thousands of years, we've made progress in our understanding about the world. And applied, or rather theoretical physics, ultimately becomes applied physics once law is proven. Once we learn things that have based themselves on evidence that we can now say, oh, wow, we understand this now. Now this becomes more a part of like our everyday principles and our laws, as opposed to just basing things on perceptions. So basing things off evidence that's revising itself. All right, Cade, what about game theory?
Yeah, so game theory is another really interesting system of thought. Just again, little background. It was first theorized by a guy named John von Neumann, who was he was a physicist, he was a computer scientist. Again, just another great thinker. But one interesting thing is not a lot of people hear the name John von Neumann in their everyday lives, but I actually did one time as a freshman economics major at Auburn University, and my professor said that he's the most brilliant man to ever live. So, of course, as an economics guy, he applies a lot of game theory in his research. So John von Neumann would have a lot of rapport in that space. But essentially, the definition of what game theory is it's a branch of mathematics, but it can be simple, and at least in simple examples, that are really concerned with analyzing strategy and how I make decisions, right? So this is all about taking our system two thinking to the next level. So it's really about looking at situations where you have competitors. So where you're looking at situations where people are not making decisions in silos. And that's actually really, really powerful type of mathematics, because we normally make our decisions with respect to what other people are making decisions, or how our decisions are going to affect other people. So essentially, it's just a mathematical tool for looking at how to optimize different situations and what's the rational way to think about making this decision if I know Shane is going to make another decision that could impact my own position, right?
Great. Okay. I like examples. I like thought experiments. How could this be applied in everyday life?
Right. So one of the most famous examples of using game theory is what we call the prisoner's dilemma, right? So let me just kind of go through this example and see if this helps, right? But essentially let's say we have Bonnie and Clyde, and they rob a bank together without a weapon, right? They just decide they're going to go and rob a bank and get some cash, right? So a witness sees them breaking into the bank. They call the police. The police catch them in the act, right? So they know they're guilty of robbing the bank, no doubt about it. But as the police go and search the bank, they find a gun that was actually stored by the bank president for whatever reason. He lives in Texas and everyone carries a gun. So he's got a gun in there. So they're going to try to go and pin this weapon onto Bonnie and Clyde and essentially up the level of their severity of the crime and up their length in prison, right? So that's the scenario. They know that they didn't commit the crime. And then as they're going back to the police station, Bonnie and Clyde are separated. So they're not together. So they can't talk about, hey, what are we going to do? How are they going to interrogate us? And so they're going to be interrogated separately. So essentially we have two different decisions that they can make, right? And in game theory, we call it either defecting or betraying or cooperating, right? Because it's all about how I make decisions in units. So if Bonnie confesses to the crime and says we actually did carry the gun, and Clyde doesn't, she's going to get 3 years in prison. If they both remain silent, they're going to get the minimum 1 year in prison because they can't convict them because they don't have any evidence. But if they both try to rat each other out, then they both get 2 years in prison. So you can draw this out on a matrix diagram where you can see what are the different results. You can add up the number of years in prison and you can see, well, this is clearly the optimal route, but only given that they both decide to not say anything. So they should cooperate. But the problem is if one of them doesn't say anything and the other one rats them out, they're going to prison for 3 years. So it's really actually super interesting if you have some time to kind of dig into prisoner's dilemma. But it has massive applications again for applying to different contexts. But that's essentially a kind of an overview, if that makes sense.
It does. I think what it's doing, or at least by applying game theory, you're recognizing what could be the best course of action after you followed your opponent's choice. So in most situations in life, we are interacting with other people, and other people are behaving, we're behaving. We want to respond to them. I mean, almost think of it like a mixed martial artist who steps back and when a hook misses him, throws the left jab or something like that. You're responding based off of the information that's available to you, based off of your opponent's choice. And you have to predict what they could choose. But you can use economics and mathematics to do it. Wasn't it John Nash, Cade, who won the Nobel Prize in economics? Did you learn about that at all, and the dominant strategy?
Nash equilibrium. Yeah, I remember talking about it. The guy from Russell Crowe played John Nash on A Beautiful Mind, right?
Yeah, that's right. And what he said was that dominant strategy is what we're constantly trying to achieve. And it's what we do that leads to minimal loss. So what at all costs we're trying to lead to minimal loss. So in the example of the prisoner's dilemma, the best thing to do is stay silent. That would achieve the dominant strategy, the best outcome for us.
Right. But what makes game theory so much more interesting than just a pure science is it actually takes into account the fact that there's statistical anomalies. People don't make decisions the same way, or they value things differently, right? For someone, going to 3 years in prison is so unthinkable that the only thing they could want to do is get out completely. And so they're going to make that decision. So if I know they're going to make that decision, then I'm going to, change my decision based on what they're going to do. But what's amazing is that there's just so many applications. And so if you think about one kind of popular one is to always think about marketing, because you're marketing in a specific area usually, and you're usually selling a good or a service that other people are also selling. So you've really got to think about, if I spend this money, you kind of imagine two different companies that are, let's say, are both selling mulch, and they have to decide, hey, I want to get more customers. So maybe I should put a big LED sign on the side of the road and maybe more people will turn in. But then you have to consider the fact that people are going to turn in because they see mulch and they really don't know about your company, and they're going to go to your competitor right there. So it gives you a way of thinking about, well, what should I do given the information that I know about my opponent? But one thing that we got to point out, Shannon, and you can kind of talk about some more examples of where we see this take place in the world, is that game theory in one simulated event isn't as interesting as game theory in the real world. Because the real world, we have ongoing events, ongoing relationships with competitors in business, or geopolitical competitors, or different relationships that you're going to stay in over time. So then the decision making becomes more complex, but it becomes more realistic.
Yeah, and I've noticed now, just in studying Bayes and game theory for about the last week and like practicing some of these problems, they're really tough. I mean, you really do have to put your mind down to the grindstone and get through some of these things. But over time, it starts to actually influence the way that I'm thinking as I'm going about my daily business. And I'm considering some of the probabilities or outcomes that I've learned through the theorems. And so how can those apply on a larger scale? I wonder, Cade, I mean, philosophers or at least economists must be applied, like they must be hiring these guys to do major strategy and the Pentagon and such all around the world.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, remember what we said, both game theory and Bayes' theorem are really only as good as the probabilities that we can ascribe to different events. So it's really about gathering information. So especially in the prisoner's dilemma or in game theory, one assumption we usually make is that they both have access to the same information. But that's not always the case. So they pay people a lot of money to do tons of really complex mathematics in order to ascribe more accurate probabilities, say, to if North Korea is going to shoot a missile in the next month or not, and based on their trajectory of their missiles, where could they be in 10 years from now? I mean, there's real massive worldwide application for this type of thinking. And we've got people that work for the federal government that are doing these kind of experiments for sure.
That's cool. And it's cool that we could practice it. Me, a layman, can practice this on the weekends and hopefully make better decisions, have more perceived outcomes or outcomes that are going to be in line with what I want them to be, as opposed to trusting intuitions.
Right. And what's cool about this is that most people that are hearing this, let's say they're hearing it for the first time, maybe you don't grasp exactly what the conditional probability tree looks like or everything about the prisoner's dilemma with the three scenarios. But for the most part, this should be at least decently recognizable to the way that we think, because we really do this. The problem is that we just don't carry it through to its conclusions, or we're too lazy to actually look at the details, and we want to just settle with a larger, kind of broader, more generalist type of view of these two strategies. So we have Bayesian theory in our heads naturally to some degree. We also have game theory in the same way. We know that this works this way, but it just gives us a little bit more power it helps us pay more attention to these specific events that we want to conjecture are related to the probability of outcomes based on our decisions.
And then you could also couple those theories or practices of those theories with just some general tenets that I think make a ton of sense when it comes to trying to improve one's own abilities to ration and think critically about problems. So, okay, let's talk about some of these tenets of rationality that were developed by Eliezer Yudkowsky, who's a modern computer scientist now. And you would probably say that he is the foremost thinker in artificial intelligence. International governments have sponsored his research. Like several, I want to say like 24 or so countries have been sponsoring his research. He's developed these tenets, you would say, of curiosity, or rather tenets of rationality. And I jumped the gun. The first tenet is curiosity. So a person who's trying to really improve their own rationality and their own thinking, wants to put away the cognitive biases, would first need to be curious. It's that burning itch to know. It kind of requires you, though, to be ignorant at the start or be comfortable being ignorant. And then the desire in life is really to relinquish your ignorance, to learn. But it really starts with a heart of curiosity. Does that make sense?
No, that makes complete sense, and it flows right into tenet number 2, and we'll just keep working through these, which is relinquishment, right? Which can be destroyed by the truth, should be destroyed by the truth. So, I mean, really, people have to open up their minds to different biases that they have or different conclusions that they've come to based on how they were raised or however else they came to the decision, but willing to relinquish those if they see that the evidence leads to a different outcome.
And that's a lot easier said than done.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the idea we're talking here about is not willing or being willing to not flinch when information that comes about that could destroy your current belief systems. You've got to be comfortable dismissing those. And that sort of moves into our next tenet of rationality, something that people can apply, which is lightness. You know, this is the idea or concept that we're letting the winds of evidence blow us around.
Right. Well, what's really interesting as we just look at those 3 and how challenging they are to fully live out of, I think it's because, at least I would say that I think that it's because people really value other things more than they value truth. And I'm not really sure that I'm ready to say that that's wrong. As much as I am ready to just say that's what I've observed. So that if people have to hold on to a belief that they have come to see is not really true, if it's based on different relationships that they have or how they're viewed by certain people, that is actually valued at a higher level than living intellectually honestly. So people are more likely to not live in a setting where they live by the tenets of relinquishment and lightness because they value other things more than truth.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that in general, I mean, we've said this throughout the series that system 1 thinking is just easier. System 2 thinking is pretty hard, especially if you've let yourself become entrenched in a certain thought process or a certain strict belief. And the principle of lightness says that like the stricter your belief system, the more likely you are to be entrenched and the less likely you'll be able to surrender to the truth when better information presents itself, because that's what we're after here, right? We're after the truth.
Right. And that leads us kind of to the 4th tenet of evenness, right? So basically says don't seek to argue for one side of the other, because if you already knew the destination, you'd already be there. You aren't the hypothesis, you're the judge. So oftentimes where we take a position far too early on in our thinking process, we find ourselves defending something just because it's comfortable to have some kind of foundation rather than allowing more information to flow until we become confident in taking one position or another. So that's kind of evenness.
Right. You'd be in the position in the center, I suppose, as 2 arguments are being compellingly sought after each other. You'd be that judge in the middle that's doing your best to make an assessment about the information. The second you find yourself in one camp and lodged in that camp, the less likely you are to do, as we've said in some of the prior concepts, and change your mind, find the truth. Okay, there's another really good principle, Kate. I'm going to jump down to principle 6, which is empiricism. This is one that makes a lot of sense to me. This is really saying that the roots of knowledge are basically in observation, and its fruits are prediction. So if you can see, hear, smell, and taste something, it's more likely to be observable and repeatable. It's more likely to be true than if it was not. And some people might say that belief without evidence is a challenging position to hold. This is sometimes where you and I will find ourselves on differing sides of the fence related to religion. But I think you can also agree that empiricism is important, at least in the practical application, that what we observe is more likely to be true than what someone has told us.
Right, right. No, no. I think that that's true. And I think that goes back to Dad, telling us our whole life, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see, because at least there's some empiricism underlying that. And I agree with you. There are a lot of things that are immaterial that are challenging to explain with empirical data. At least right now they are, like information. Like, what is information? What is energy? We have trouble explaining what the essence of certain things are. But essentially, what we're saying is that you ought not to live out of a worldview that isn't first and foremost coherent, right? It's not logical, and B, it doesn't correspond to the realities that you're experiencing. So that's part of observation, right? Is what I'm hearing true because I believe that it's true and it seems true in and of itself, but then also that I see that it's true, right? Like the law of gravity, right? Very few people can derive the law of gravity, right? You just can't. But I can believe it because I've actually experienced the law of gravity as being true in and of itself. So, anyways, that's just kind of another way I think about it.
Yeah. And I think it takes humility, which would be tenet number 8,
Right.
to apply all of these things. Humility is encompassing. And I like this phrase or saying that the people that are the most humble are the people who are preparing for the deepest and most catastrophic errors in their own beliefs and plans. So again, it comes back to the people who are consistently challenging their own thought processes, applying some of the theorems that we've talked about, or at least just applying an empirical data-based resolve to get to the truth. And it's the people who are willing to change their mind, who are less likely to be stuck and entrenched, who are more likely to find these better outcomes, a rational way of thinking.
Right. And I think you could make an argument that this tenet may stand above the others in terms of what's most unnatural to human beings, to be humble and to respect the views of others. And I can just I think I could sit here for a long time and explain how in the last 5 years my position on different things on different social issues, on different political issues has changed as I've had the humility to go and take in other information from the other side, ask people questions, and all of a sudden it became much, much harder to sit on the outside. And I think that was kind of the conservatism bias, right, that we talked about, where you only surround yourself with people that and news sources that affirm your view, as opposed to always reaching out to the outside and asking, is this still coherent and corresponding to the reality that I see? Is this still a rational position to hold? And so that's one I would absolutely encourage you and myself both, and of course anyone else listening to this, to strive for that humility. And as soon as you think you're right, you're probably not right. I don't know if you remember, Shane, the old parable of Socrates, where the Oracle of Delphi told him that he went to go seek a prophetic word from the Oracle of Delphi, and he says, "You're the wisest man in the world." He says, "No, there's no way." So Socrates said, "There's no way I'm the wisest man in the world." So he went to the politicians, to the warriors, and to the businessmen, to the 3 classes of people in the Greek Empire, and he goes and he talks with them, and basically his conclusion is that I am the wisest person in the world because I'm the only one that realizes I don't have it all figured out. He goes to these 3 different groups, and they all think that they have it all figured out, but they don't really understand what the other groups bring to the table. But anyways, that's just kind of an interesting side story for humility.
No, that ties in nicely as well with this principle of simplicity, which is one I skipped, but I want to cover now since you brought it up in that form. I mean, simplicity basically says that the more complex your belief system, or the more details that there are in your belief system, all that is adding is just yet another chance for you to be wrong, or another detail that is likely to be wrong, because we are so frequently wrong, as has been proven at least in that last episode. So applying a more simplistic worldview, I'd like to be the one who's quick to say, I don't know. That's something that's changed in me over at least a few years now, because the more I've learned, the more I realize that I don't know. And it seems that the more I learn, the more likely there are holes in the things that I am learning. So a simplistic approach to a worldview would be beneficial from my point of view.
Yeah, and the scientific principle of Occam's razor, that the simplest approach is usually most right, or whatever I have to make the fewest amount of assumptions about is usually the more stable ground to lie on. But let's move into tenet number 9, which is perfectionism, which is basically the more errors you correct in yourself, the more you notice. And really, that to me, Shane, seems really tied to humility, that when you start to see the flaws that you have, although you're working towards correcting those flaws, it becomes easier to see that you have flaws in and of themselves, and that you do need to take that kind of humble approach as you're moving towards hopefully a more accurate way of understanding the world.
Right. And it's not until you recognize that there's potential for the flaw that you're kind of ready to advance. Seems like some East Asian philosophies or something, but there are a lot of truths, I think, in that, at least as it applies to being more rational in mind.
Right.
Another principle, Kate, is precision. There's a good example for precision, what it represents. If you think about a quantity that's between 1 and 100, one person tells you that the quantity is between 40 and 50, and the other person tells you that the quantity is 42. Well, both people are correct, but which one is more beneficial for you? Obviously, the person who gave you the more precise information that the quantity is 42, not just between 40 and 50. So we should be trying to be, I think, precise in our approach to learning and as our approach to thinking.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great tenet. It makes a lot of sense that we need to drive towards more accurate and really that's what, I mean, it feels like that's what science is able to do is we kind of have a general idea about where we want to be, and then over time the scope narrows and we become more accurate in our predictions and in our way of thinking about the world. But the last one, number 11, is scholarship, right? So this is kind of one of those things that we can, that part of this podcast is really, we're trying to represent the tenet of scholarship by doing some studies on these kind of things and reading about the different sciences that teach you how to think. And really, this is probably something we could unpack a little bit about learning how to think as opposed to just learning technical exercises. We talked about this in relation to like how we educate young people, but instead of being really quick to try to understand how to do probability theory, it's probably better to first understand what are the foundations for how I think, and using that kind of principle to then move into the more technical assignments that you might come to endeavor on.
Right. So given everything we've learned about cognitive biases and now about this quest for rationality using Bayes' theorem, or Bayes' reasoning rather, and game theory, and now some of these tenets of rationality, Cade, what are some major takeaways for you? Because I'd say for me, the very first takeaway that comes to mind is that having read Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, I want to stop now. Before I make a conclusion or before I jump to make a decision, I'm trying to press the pause button more in my own life. Just in the last 2 weeks, it's like a little practical application. Like press pause, let's think through this again. Maybe not necessarily drawing out on the chalkboard Bayes' reasoning or some of these principles, but at least thinking probably about what the outcome of my decisions are and how influenced have I been. But for you, what kind of takeaways have you gotten from the series?
Well, I think we talked a lot about it in week number 1, and I think week number 2 drives on it as well, but really just trying to become a more thoughtful person. Like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Because at the end of the day, a lot of these questions, Shane, these ways of thinking, we really want to employ them in order to get to a better result, right? And so that result is semi-subjective in terms of what people value, right? Different people want different things out of life. And what I would argue is that far too many people, and I myself, find myself in circumstances that are just based on arbitrary decisions that aren't really based on, this is what I value. And I value this so highly that I'm going to employ every minute of my time, every dollar that I own, all of my resources, and drive towards this goal. And so to me, it's just the laziness it's kind of a rebuke to me in terms of the way that I approach things. And it says, I need to know why I think what I think, is it accurate or not? And then try to be a more thoughtful person. But I agree with you too, that part of this is just being a better listener, probably something you and I could both work on quite a bit with our wives and with different relationships. And we come to see our own humanity, our own failures in the way that we think about certain things. And I think that can help us apply those types of failures that we have towards understanding that other parts of our thinking are also probably flawed.
Right. But that's the scary part about it for me, to take a pause and to recognize some vulnerability in the process of thinking through this stuff just shows me that there's a possibility that what I've thought all along could be incorrect. And that's a scary thought, right? It does require a significant amount of humility and vulnerability to take this approach, as opposed to just considerably trusting all of the perceptions, all of the intuitions, the preconceived thoughts and the same thought process that I've been on my entire life. Why might I just now all of a sudden press pause and rethink things? It's vulnerable. It's a bit scary.
Right. And all of these things though too are just another way of thinking. So they need to be evaluated with the same degree. It's we could get a little bit lost here in our thoughts as we get to all these layers. But I think it was you that were talking last week about Kahneman who did a lot of this research on how we think poorly in system 1 and system 2 type thinking. And he's basically says I'm maybe moderately better than you guys are at this. But this is almost something intrinsic to human beings. So when we can rise above our own kind of instincts and I don't know, just kind of our wiring. I kind of think about an animal that a dog just acts like a dog because that's its nature, and human beings seem to have a power over nature that we can recognize our nature and try to adjust it, right? And we're not just completely slaves to it. And I think that this is part of what this type of higher level thinking can help us do, is to think about, I don't have to be this way because I am this way. I can change, and I can introduce new types of thinking if I think they're more accurate.
Right. That's the difference in us and the animals, as we talked about, like consciousness. And so maybe it's the consciousness that's requiring us or forcing us to think about this stuff in the first place. But it's a challenging topic. I mean, in some ways, it's easier to just go about these other academic studies that we've been on. You know, we've thought about like electric cars, and we've just kind of looked at when the electric car is going to come into play in our lifetime. But this requires like a significantly more introspective approach. Requires us to really step back and to really look at the way that we are driven and our incentives and motivations that are affecting our thinking. And it's just a challenging topic all around, but been very enlightening for me.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to strip away the motivations that in the underlying kind of just pillars that are driving us towards whatever it is that we're seeking in life. I don't know if we've ever stripped those things away. I'm not even sure if that's oxymoronic, because then what would we be pursuing? You know, it seems like even truth in and of itself, just to pursue it, we're pursuing it because we think it's valuable. So we've made a value-based decision. So everyone's making value-based decisions every day. And I just think that we would live in a better society, in a more empathetic society, in a more scholarly society and humble society, and all these tenets of thinking, if we were to try to employ deeper levels of thought. I mean, even so, just I give you this quick example, just talking to a couple that we were hanging out with after church, and just one of the gentlemen that they have a friend that just broke up with this guy who just wasn't okay with interracial marriage. And it's kind of a weird concept. He wasn't okay with interracial marriage.
But can you back up and say, wait, who broke up with who because of interracial marriage?
So we were talking to our friends about their friend who just broke up with a guy because, and they're both Caucasian, but she asked the question, if we had a child and they wanted to marry someone from a different race, how would you feel about that? And he wasn't okay with that.
Oh, so they were of the same race, but one guy said, hey, ostensibly, I'm not okay with interracial marriage. Whoa.
Yeah, so sorry, I must have explained that really
No,
poorly.
I got you.
But anyways, and our friends are Hispanic, and so they were just talking to us about how I can't believe we're still dealing with this. But then I was kind of thinking about it. I was like, I'm really not that shocked that we're still dealing with this, right? And I started thinking a little bit. This is system 1 type thinking, right? He probably grew up in an environment where that was the way that it was, and maybe someone tried to ascribe some kind of value. Maybe someone said this is why it should be that way, and he probably didn't think much about it. And so it's just the foundation that he's been entrenched in. And the fact of the matter is, we're all standing on a foundation. So what we need to be doing is deconstructing what's wrong and building on top of it what is right. But we're all have a foundation for how we think about things, whether or not it's rational or irrational. So I was just thinking about that and saying, my goodness, that we still live in a society where someone could think that way. And you say, based on what evidence, sir? And you just ask him, why do you think that way? And after a few series of the why question, I find that most people are just in an arbitrary place. Right? You ask why. Why I think this, but why do you think that? Because I apparently why, and then you ask 3 or 4 questions of why, and all of a sudden you get to, well, I can't really explain it. Just where I find myself. And I think that's the kind of arbitrariness that we want to try to dispel as much as we can.
That's actually a really good principle. Maybe the 3 whys would be a basis or a test of one's own abilities to think using system 2. If I've made a decision and I can ask myself now intuitively these 3 whys. If I can't logic myself all the way down to that 3rd why, then I either have to be comfortable recognizing that my decision or my position is faulty, or is at least in need of refinement, and we need to continue to achieve perfectionism, continuing to work towards improvement on that idea. I really like that.
Yeah, it may not be wrong. It just is lazy, right? You just haven't thought it through. You might be in the exact same place that you would have been had you thought it through, but it's much better. And I just find that most people, the why question is one of the questions that is most it's like it's almost wrong to ask why. And we've talked about this before, and we should do an entire podcast episode on different kind of ways of raising kids. But when parents refuse to tell their kids why, I think that's bad. I think that can be lazy parenting. And I know I'm not a parent yet, so maybe maybe I'm employing system one type thinking, and I don't know because I don't have any data on raising kids. But anyways, at least where I stand today is that that's not the right way to approach it. Explain to them why. If they don't want to know why, if a kid doesn't genuinely want to know, then I get the parent saying just because I said so. But that's not why we should do things. We shouldn't do things just because our parent said so. We shouldn't do things just because this is what I've always done, right? I find that this is applicable, Shane, for everything. In a company of my size, 14,000 people, you ask people, why are we doing it this way? And I used to think, surely at a company of our size, surely after this much evolving and we're a Fortune 30 company, someone's going to have an answer for me. And what I found is, no, they don't. It's because we've always done it this way. But even though this is backwards, yeah, that's just the way that we do it, right? So asking that why question is a really important thing to do.
Well, so let's leave it at that. Let's leave the why question as our conclusive statement for this now series of 2 episodes, which for me have really shown that my biases are apparent in almost everything that I do. And if I can't answer the question why at least 3 levels down, there's probably need for me to reevaluate my position. So it's been a good series, Cade. I don't know what we're going to get up to next, but it's been a lot of fun. Any parting shots for the crowd?
No, I don't think so. I'm interested. Maybe we need to do a quick Bayes theorem question on whether or not my Cavs are going to beat your Golden State Warriors in the finals. But actually, it's looking like right now they're having a little trouble finishing up with the Spurs. So we'll see.
Have a score right now?
No, they were down 20 at the half though. So we'll see. Lots of exciting content for our next Beer Banter episode for sure.
Yeah, well, before we get there, we got to talk UFC for just 1 sec because we got to do it. As long as our wives aren't barking at us to shut down the podcast. Cade, I guess you didn't catch UFC 211 yesterday?
No, I did see the knockout. It was Junior Dos Santos got knocked out?
Yeah, he got knocked out in the first round. He's such a quality guy, a nice guy. But these are the big boys, right? The 245-pounders. And Stipe Miocic is just at the top of his game. The Cleveland guy. This is another thing, man. Cleveland's on fire these days. But
yeah,
he just can't be beat. He's really, really good. But the best fight of the night, Cade, tested our beloved practice of jiu-jitsu. For me, the best fight of the night. Other people maybe say it was the most boring. I don't know. But Damian Maia fought this guy whose name is escaping me right now for some reason, but like a real power puncher and a well-rounded mixed martial artist. Damian Maia is nearly 40 years old, but he's probably the best or is the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner that's ever been a part of the UFC. And he's been winning now for 7 fights in a row, and he's just a spider. You know, he comes at you, he's going to lock you up, he's going to take a few punches to the face, and he's okay with that. Like, it's part of his game. Like, take one punch to the face so that it opens up a weakness, and I can grab a calf, and next thing you know, he's pulled guard, and he's somehow got his hooks in you, and he just sets those hooks, and he works for 5 minutes to strangle you, and all you can do is resist. And he did it again last night against a much younger, much more talented, much more like athletic guy. And this guy cracked him a few times. Damian Maia got cracked in the face, but Damian Maia, the joke today is that they call him Damian the Backpack Maia because he just jumped on this guy's back and wouldn't give it up.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool. All right, kid. Well, we can leave it at that. And until next week, it's been a good series. And that's all I got. Talk to you next week, little brother.
All right, later, big brother.